afternoon and welcome to City Club of Portland Friday Forum. I'm John Horvick, City Club President, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who join us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today, we'll hear from Sandy Baruah as he discusses the path forward for Detroit and the lessons the Motor City has for the City of Roses. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Geffen Mesher, Iberdrola Renewables, Perkins Coie, Portland General Electric, and Providence Health and Services. We are grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Next week, City Club will present the Civic Awards, and Chief Education Officer Nancy Golden will discuss her priorities for 40-40-20. Next Tuesday, November 5th, we'll be hosting our monthly Civic Drinks event. Civic Drinks is a mix of informal conversation, connection, and cocktails. It's your opportunity to mingle with local leaders, City Club members, and others involved and interested in civic issues. This month, we're partnering with over 20 organizations who are leaders in workforce development and training. On November 7th, our member-led Forum Committee is hosting a free event with Andrea Durbin, Executive Director of the Oregon Environmental Council, and State Representative Alyssa Kenny-Geyer, that will explore toxins in our daily lives. You can learn more about these and other club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, City Club will be live tweeting at today's event. You can follow or mention us at PDX City Club, and be sure to use the hashtag CityClub in your own tweets. We have a Q&A session with our guests at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone to ask your questions. And for all our audience participants, please locate the index cards in the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We'll collect them prior to the start of the Q&A. And now to our program. Detroit was once America's most prosperous city with the highest per capita income. It was the city that embodied American innovation and industry and served as the arsenal of democracy for World War II. How could a city of such greatness fall so hard and so far? What is the path forward for Detroit, and what lessons does the Motor City have for the City of Roses? First, I'd like to bring up Sandy McDonough to introduce Sandy Baruah. Sandy McDonough currently serves as the president and CEO of the Portland Business Alliance. Before joining the Alliance, Sandy had a 2-decade career in the energy industry, working for both the San Francisco-based PG&E Corporation and PacifiCorp. Earlier, she was a newspaper reporter for 10 years, with reporting stints at the Oregonian and the Seattle Times. She has more than 30 years of civic and community leadership in the Portland area. She is currently serving on the boards of Associated Oregon Industries, Greater Portland, Inc., International Women's Forum, New Avenues for Youth, Pioneer Courthouse Square, Thomas and Edison High School, Travel Portland, the University of Oregon Alumni Association, and the U.S. National Bank Community Advisory Board. Please join me in welcoming Sandy McDonough to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. You gotta wonder when I have time to do my job, don't you? I'm very excited to be here today, but I have to admit I was even a little more excited when City Club board member Sharon Robbins called and asked me to be part of this program. She said City Club wanted to hear from an outstanding University of Oregon graduate named Sandy, middle initial K, who spent time living and working in Washington, D.C., and now runs a major city chamber. Here I am. Then Sharon said he would offer some interesting perspectives about how a large city deals with the financial crisis that drives them to bankruptcy. Obviously, I'm no he, and thankfully, Portland's fiscal house is in pretty good shape. So I figured that Sharon had to be talking about my colleague in Detroit, Michigan, Oregon kid and loyal duck, Sandy Baruah. Sandy would say he is an Oregonian, a Washingtonian, as in D.C., and now a Michigander. He was born in our nation's capital, then raised in Oregon, where he earned degrees from the University of Oregon and Willamette. He still considers Oregon his real home, and in fact, used to be member of the City Club. I'm sure that Sam Adams would be happy to sign you up again today, Sandy. Sandy spent a majority of his career in Washington, D.C., working first for Senator Bob Packwood, who is here with us today, and then serving in the administrations of both Presidents Bush. Sandy's D.C. career culminated with his service as head of the U.S. Small Business Administration, reporting directly to President George W. Bush. I have to say that while at the Small Business Administration, Sandy was always very gracious and helpful to visitors from Oregon, including the members of the Portland Business Alliance as we made our annual trek to Washington, D.C. During his work with George W. Bush, Sandy played some unique roles, including representing the United States before the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. He was involved in the post-Katrina recovery efforts, and he helped prepare the government for the 2010 census. Lastly, he had a front row seat at the White House during the credit crisis and the auto bailouts of 2008 and 2010, where he made the connections with the Detroit auto industry that led to his present job as president and CEO of the Detroit Regional Chamber. At the Chamber, Sandy is the principal voice for the Detroit region's business community, which includes 13 Fortune 500 companies, on issues such as education reform, state policy, and Detroit's municipal bankruptcy. He's frequently interviewed by the national media about the very difficult issues facing his city. Sandy serves on the boards of WavePoint Ventures, the Automotive Hall of Fame, the U.S. Council on Competitiveness, and he was an advisor to Northern Spain's Economic Competitive Council, which is called Orchestra. Today, Sandy's going to give us some perspective on what we have been hearing in the national news about the issues facing Detroit, and he will share some lessons that American cities can learn from what Detroit is dealing with. Please join me in welcoming Sandy Baruah.
Well, good afternoon. It is such a pleasure to be home here in Portland. And after attending City Club meetings for 25 years, it's nice to be on this side of the podium for a change. It's a wonderful opportunity to see some old friends, and I'm honored that my friend, my former boss, my mentor, Senator Bob Packwood is here. Senator, thank you for coming. Elaine, thank you so much for being here. I want to thank Mayor Adams for his public service and his new role as the head of this great club, Jill Gibson-Odell of the board who arranged this invitation, and of course my friend and my counterpart, Sandy McDonough, for that gracious introduction and for joining me on this program. Detroit is a special place, one with a proud history and one that I, as a Portlander, am proud to be associated with. I say this because I want to frame the discussion. I'm not going to give you today a Chamber of Commerce speech. My aim today will be to paint an accurate picture of America's largest city to file for bankruptcy, the good, the bad, and the promise. I'll touch on Detroit's history and how that's relevant to the situation today, an update on the municipal bankruptcy, and finally, some real reasons for optimism. So first, the history lesson. Let's go back in time, before the manufacturing revolution, back in the days of the fur trade. Michigan was established as a home rule state, a decentralized approach to government placing a priority on local control. Villages, townships, cities, and counties became the principal and driving force in government. This led to immense pride in local communities and very important local government boundaries. A perfect example is the community in which Lisa, my wife, and I now live. It's called Grosse Pointe. Many of you know it through the John Cusack movie of 1999. It's exactly the same, just less gunfire. So Grosse Pointe is 11 square miles, has about 50,000 residents, all with wonderfully manicured lawns, all with the same standard issue Volvo or Buick SUV in the driveway, and they all have children that look exactly the same. But there are 5 Grosse Pointes: the park, the city, the farms, the woods, and the shores. Each one of these gross points has their own mayor, their own city council, their own police department, their own fire department, their own park system. This is emblematic of Michigan. It is local control at its finest. And in fact, Michigan has more units of local government than just about any other state in the nation. So when immigrants came from all over the world to Michigan, and African Americans moved from the South to Michigan in the promise of jobs back in the day, the leading edge thinking of the time was to segregate all of these different kinds of people into their own communities. Now, this is not an unusual migration pattern, but in this case, it was sanctioned by the auto barons of the day, making it, they thought at the time, that they would make it more comfortable for people to assimilate if they were kept kind of within their group, and the best way to keep harmony. So now these strong villages and these local governments now have a very strong ethnic flavor to them. And if you fast forward to the heyday of the American auto industry, when the Detroit companies sold 90%, if not more, of all the vehicles sold and made in the United States, now we've added a layer of company association with these various small communities with very significant ethnic patina to them. Then when you add the success of the auto industry, you had a situation where every Ford sold was one less Chevy sold, every union victory was one less management victory. You could slice and dice the communities through Southeast Michigan by, are you a GM, what ethnic group, management, or union community? This laid the seeds for a zero-sum, I win, you lose culture that is still prevalent in Michigan today. Even today, when you land at the Detroit International Airport, which is actually a beautiful airport, you are greeted by signs welcoming you to each one of the various counties. Welcome to Macomb County, next to welcome to Wayne County, welcome to Oakland County, as if a visitor from Paris or New York is going to really know or care what county they have just stepped into. But despite all of this, Detroit, through about 1920 to about 1950, became the wealthiest city per capita in the nation. This wealth was created not just by putting the world on wheels, which it obviously did, but Detroit was the innovative hub for the country. In fact, the economic and innovative impact of Detroit and Michigan back in the day outshines even the impact that we associate with Silicon Valley today. And it goes beyond that. We were the arsenal of democracy for World War II, invented modern marketing and branding. Not bad for a half a century's work. So today, when people ask about the situation in Detroit, and they say, gosh, is it really as bad as it seems on national television? I say, absolutely not. It's actually far worse. As a result of this hubris, the inability to recognize the realities of a changing world, stunningly poor urban planning, and a long-term inability to manage government, these are the facts that Detroit shares. A city population that has plummeted from 2 million to less than 700,000 in about 50 years, an adult illiteracy rate that is estimated at 40%, an official unemployment rate of 16%, but the real number is probably closer to 50, a household income of $27,000. And despite its reputation as the motor city, fully 1/3 of Detroit City residents do not have access to a personal vehicle. The crime problems and education problems are well documented, and the city government is so dysfunctionally set up that it struggles to keep streetlights on and to collect taxes from its businesses and residents. And while the major-scale corruption of Mayor Kwame Kilpatrick ended with his departure, and the city has been blessed with the integrity of Dave Bing for the last 4 years, Smaller scale grafts, such as payoffs for fire inspectors and building inspectors, continue to be reported. And of course, there is the historic bankruptcy. With an operating deficit this year of about $200 million and an overall debt of about $18 billion with no way to repay it. This, folks, is what I mean by not giving a Chamber of Commerce speech. So a state law was passed in December of 2012, which actually was a replacement law for a law repealed by voters, but that's another story, that provided the governor the authority to place an emergency manager in failing municipalities with the powers to override the locally elected mayor and city council. Several units of government in Michigan, appointed by both Democrat and Republican governors, have had an emergency manager. And the purpose of this law and the laws that preceded it was for an emergency manager appointed by the duly elected governor to make the tough decisions at the local level that the local officials were either unwilling or unable to make, with the goal of putting that municipality on a financially sustainable path and with the hopes of staving off bankruptcy, which is allowed, obviously, in Michigan, and that's not the case in all states, including the state of Oregon. Governor Rick Snyder, a practical and fairly moderate Republican, Senator, you would like him if you served in the Senate with you guys would be peas in a pod, appointed Kevin Orr, a DC-based bankruptcy attorney, formerly with the Jones Day law firm, the emergency manager for the city of Detroit in the spring of 2013. Mr. Orr has since determined that the city of Detroit had no other option other than to file for bankruptcy. This decision surprised absolutely no one who had the grasp of the obvious and was paying attention. Now, this emergency manager, acting on behalf of the city, with the approval of the governor, must prove in federal court two key things. First, that the city is indeed insolvent. And second, that the city attempted to negotiate in good faith with creditors and bondholders before pursuing the bankruptcy option. These court proceedings are underway as we speak. Unions and those representing the city employees are arguing that the governor rushed to bankruptcy, did not try to resolve the financial issues through negotiation, and he should have demanded that certain pots of money, such as pension funds, were to be untouched in bankruptcy. The challenge with these arguments was that the moment the emergency manager was placed in Detroit, the unions drew a very loud and very clear line in the sand that they were not willing to offer any concessions at all. And their hard stance early on has cost them in this negotiation. In fact, many of our friends in the union movement said that we actually want to go into bankruptcy court because we think we'll do better in bankruptcy court than we would negotiating with the emergency manager, a tune that they're singing slightly differently today. And while municipal bankruptcies differ in some key aspects from a corporate or personal bankruptcy, it's pretty difficult to go into bankruptcy court and say, hey, can't pay all my bills. There's this pot of money sitting right over here, but we don't want you to touch it. It's kind of a difficult case to make. Now, it's important to understand that unlike a corporate bankruptcy, the judge in a municipal bankruptcy needs to take into account the ongoing sustainability of the municipality in question. The city cannot go out of business. And so this gives the city, and the city workers, frankly, an advantage that businesses do not share. Two other interesting wrinkles here. Michigan's Constitution protects workers' pensions. This was enshrined in the Constitution years and years ago to prevent workers from being left high and dry in the event a company used bankruptcy as a ruse to tap promised pensions for other purposes. Federal law, however, offers no such protection. So this issue will need to be resolved, but it is widely expected, as it usually is, that federal law will trump state law in this case. And also, I'm sure you've heard about the art. The Detroit Institute of Arts is one of the premier collections of art in the nation. It is truly spectacular. Much of this collection is actually still owned by the city of Detroit, and the estimates of its value range from a low of $3 billion to a high of $20 billion. Real money, as Everett Dirksen might have said. And there's certainly much consternation in town that some of this art will be lost in the bankruptcy. So these are unprecedented issues, and it is not lost on us in Detroit that the nation is watching and possibly setting the precedent for future municipal bankruptcies. The situation in Detroit shows that there are no easy answers. Better options for Detroit are available only via a time machine. The city borrowed money in good faith. Nobody held a gun to the city's head and said, you must take this money, or that you must spend wildly beyond your ability to repay. But it is likely that bondholders, creditors, pensioners will take significant haircuts, even if the art is sold, pensions are reduced, and other assets are sold. So this is where things stand with bankruptcy today. It's widely expected that the federal court will greenlight the bankruptcy, and the next step will be for emergency manager Orr to present his financial restructuring plan to the court, and the court will determine if indeed the city has put up enough of its assets to resolve its debts. As important as this bankruptcy proceeding is, it's actually only one half, the front half of the Detroit equation. And this is what I meant by things are not as bad as they seem, that they're worse. Fixing the books is only one part of the problem. What needs to be addressed is city operations, city management, city execution. How will the city be reorganized to allow for a sustainable, efficient, and effective governance? For an analogy, we can look no further than the office down the street from my office, General Motors. General Motors went through bankruptcy, but had they only fixed their books and did nothing else, their bankruptcy proceeding would have been to no avail. Fixing the books was only the first part of the equation, because what General Motors did was that they took advantage of bankruptcy to change how they operated and the product they put on the street. That's exactly what Detroit needs to do, and that's exactly how we view this bankruptcy. It's a turning point, but we have to do the hard work beyond fixing the books. So my first day in Detroit, a little over 3 years ago, I adopted the position, after my experience going in and out of the city, that this great American city can, and just as importantly, should be saved. But it wouldn't be saved by putting lipstick on a pig, but rather boldly confronting the city's problems. And I'm very fond of saying that the best way for Detroit to fix its PR problem is to fix its problem. And I'm not the only one who's thinking this way, and there is now real reason for optimism in Detroit. For a generation, Detroiters looked to government and perhaps the auto companies to solve their problems. Today, the leadership is more evenly spread among the business and the civic communities. Very few are waiting for the next great government program. Even in a city that is very heavily Democratic, no one is looking to President Obama to come to the rescue. This new strategy, and frankly, perspective, is working. Since about 2009, 2010, there has been $10 billion, that's yes, billion with a B, dollars in private sector investment in the city of Detroit. These are not public works programs, this is not government money, these are individual companies saying, I'm going to invest in Detroit. This has led to 12,000 new jobs in the city of Detroit in the last 4 years. What was once a ghost town downtown now actually has traffic jams. Our poster child for this new Detroit investment is Dan Gilbert. Dan is the founder and CEO of Quicken Loans. He's a Detroit native, And he's bought just about every historic building and buildable property in downtown Detroit. I think his building count now is up to 20. He is rehabbing these buildings, making them truly cool, and filling them with tech companies and fun retail. He even got Twitter to locate their newest office in downtown Detroit. Thanks to Quicken and an army of a whole bunch of other companies, Detroit now has the second fastest growing IT cluster in the nation, supported by the most concentrated entrepreneurial support system in the country. Housing prices in the city of Detroit are up about 20% over the last 18 months. University District and downtown housing is completely sold out, and new buildings that come online open their doors fully leased. Detroit's assets include 4 major sports teams: football, baseball, hockey, and basketball. We don't count soccer because you can't play it in the snow. With 3 of these teams located right downtown, and while you expect sellout crowds for the Detroit Red Wings and my beloved Detroit Tigers, even the Detroit Lions sell out on a regular basis. Detroit is getting its first light rail line, which is an initiative not of government, but of the private sector and philanthropy, which will be coordinated with a new regional rapid bus system championed by our Republican governor. Detroit has a downtown riverfront built mostly with private funds that stretches 2.5 miles with 5 miles planned. That would be perfectly at home right here in Portland. Detroit is the busiest international crossing in the world, and the city sits right on the border of America's largest trading partner, Canada. Detroit is actually becoming cool. It's a place for urban pioneers, for artists, for entrepreneurs, for those who want to work in tech, engineering, or marketing, but don't want to blend in a place like Chicago or New York. And these people, these young professionals, are truly engaged in the city. And this is not a marketing line. The fastest growing demographic in the city of Detroit is under 35, college educated, and employed. And while these facts are good and true, a little personal context. Having lived in Portland and Washington, D.C. most of my life, I know what a walkable city is. I am attuned to the aspects of placemaking. My office in downtown Detroit is about a 20-minute walk from Comerica Park where the Tigers play. My first baseball season in 2010, that was a lonely 20-minute walk. Not sure I was unsafe, but I certainly didn't feel safe. Today, that 20-minute walk, just in 3 years, has transformed radically. Coffee shops, bars, retail, some cool public spaces, but most importantly, people are out and about. And you get asked for change a lot less than you do than here in Portland. And if you want a sign of change has come to the city of Detroit, here's probably the best example. The leading candidate for mayor in the election that's going to be held on Tuesday is a white dude who came from the business community. And Detroit is a city that is 83% African American. To put this in perspective, the parallel would be if Portlanders elected a card-carrying NRA Republican as its mayor. Sam's in the background saying, we don't even let those people in the city. As exciting as what's happening in the city, we all know that economies are really regional, not really city-based. And the picture looks even brighter when you look at the entire Detroit region. So this is what the Detroit region looks like today. Highest per capita population of engineers on the planet, 7th highest per capita population of PhDs in the nation, home to 13 Fortune 500 companies, encompasses by far the greatest concentration of automotive and transportation R&D on the planet, and has one of the larger defense corridors in the nation. And by the way, speaking of the auto industry, it's not just doing exceptionally well from both a product and a financial standpoint. It is an incredibly fertile platform for leading-edge consumer electronics, advanced composite materials, alternate propulsion technologies. The region is also home to the greatest supply of fresh water on the planet. It encompasses 3 national research universities and has the 3rd highest concentration of university research spending in the country. We're in the top 5 for ongoing medical trials and have some of the highest performing healthcare systems in the nation, including the Henry Ford system, which is the only healthcare institution ever to earn the National Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. We have either the #1 or #2, depending on the year, airport in the nation. Michigan is now 17th in venture capital and rising rapidly. And while Detroit's household income is the troubling $27,000 I just mentioned, the surrounding communities have an average household income of north of $100,000. In fact, the 5th wealthiest county in the country, Oakland, abuts Detroit's northern border, and 2 of Detroit's neighboring counties have AAA bond ratings. In fact, when you compare Detroit side by side with the Portland region, you see the following things. The Detroit region, 5.3 million people. Portland, 3 million people. Percentage of people with a college degree. Detroit, 28%. Portland, a little higher at 31%, but fairly close. Household income. Detroit, 52,000. Portland, 49,000. Average wage per job that is filled today, Detroit, 51,000, actually a little higher than 51,000. Portland, 48,000. And if you just do a straight per capita income, they're even at $39,000 a year. So if you're a demographer, the Portland region and the Detroit region look a lot more alike than you might first think. But more importantly than the numbers, the biggest change is what's happening to the culture. For generations, the Detroit region was based on big companies, big government, big unions, big nonprofits, over 100 years old, Chamber qualifies for that. Today we see the focus shifting from big to nimble, from corporate to entrepreneurial, traits that Portlanders and Oregonians have long valued. The days of business as usual are certainly over. If anyone is left in Detroit who felt that we were just one great Chevy away from reliving the glory days of the past, those people are no longer relevant and, more importantly, no longer listened to. So these are just a few of the reasons why I'm so very excited about Detroit and the region. Certainly it's not an area devoid of challenges, but one that's rich in history, and there's a great American underdog quality to what's happening to Detroit. While Detroiters are tired of the national news showcasing what we call ruin porn, photo after photo of burnt out buildings, and the nation has long suffered from what I call Detroit fatigue. People are just tired of hearing about the woes of Detroit over decades. Something interesting has happened. Americans no longer find a negative story about Detroit newsworthy. There's a growing crowd across the nation that has moved from dismissive of Detroit to interested to Detroit, and now we're starting to see people actually root for Detroit. Because America loves a good underdog story. And finally, what's happening in Detroit is important. While the ills that Detroit faces are no doubt extreme, they mirror the trends that are happening across the nation. Government has been slow to use techniques and management practices that has enabled the private sector to offer more volume, speed, quality, innovation at lower prices. Government is a step behind in creating efficient and effective operations. We're seeing that in Detroit. Across America and in our national government, we see debts ever growing, and as we see in Detroit, this has real consequences. It doesn't mean the needs of the people are not very real. They are real and important, but we need to balance that with the ability to deliver. Detroit also points out the folly of just simply ever-increasing taxation. Detroit city taxes are among the highest in the nation. As businesses and taxpayers left the city of Detroit, all that was left was an increased challenged population. Detroit shows that it's important to leave someone behind who can pay the bills. And I often say that taxation is not much different than buying a car. If you can charge Cadillac prices, that's great, but you need to deliver a Cadillac. You can't charge Cadillac prices and deliver a Vega. This is why places like Boston and Minneapolis have been so successful, even though they are high-tax areas. They deliver what businesses consider to be of value. And that's important in today's marketplace where dollars, people, and companies are ever more fluid than they have ever been. So the Detroit story is important because when you look at these trends, Detroit is America, just sooner. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandy. That was really interesting and some perspective on what we see in the national news all the time. Your ending, though, Detroit is America, only sooner. What are you warning us about?
So when you look at just about every national trend, how is the country doing on innovation? How is the country doing on job creation? How is the country doing on educational achievement? You name it. We look at the World Economic Forum data. You can look at any data you want. We're just so used to seeing the United States at #1 of all of these lists, and now we're kind of getting close to about 20. So in some ways, as a society, and this is not a political comment, this is not a Democrat versus Republican comment, but as a society, we're kind of going in the wrong direction. And Detroit is the extreme, and I stress extreme, it is the extreme example of all of these trends. The public education system, has, no one really dealt with it or fixed it, and it is now the worst in the nation. It is the extreme example of you can tax yourself out of business, right? Because people left, obviously, for the suburbs or other cities. It is just the extreme example of some of the trends that, someone who has been dealing with national issues ever since I started working for the senator back in 1985, I worry about.
I was interested in the income data that you shared with us. A few years ago, we at the Portland Business Alliance published a report comparing wages and incomes in Portland, the Portland metropolitan area, to other places around the country, and actually Detroit came up in that, and we pointed out that our per capita income was about the same as Detroit's, and I have to admit that the blowback was hard because here in Portland, we don't like to be compared to what we view as Rust Belt areas unless we think the comparison is going to be favorable. And since then, we've been trying to really educate people about what it takes to raise wages and incomes for everybody and the importance of business in that equation. And honestly, in this region, in this state, what we find is that representing business can be tough. Candidates run against business. How is business viewed as a political element in Detroit and in Michigan?
Oddly enough, in the city of Detroit, the challenges are really not that much different than you have in Portland, but for different reasons. So there was a generation of people who worked very hard, maybe graduated high school, and there was an unwritten contract that if you worked hard, graduated from high school, you could go work for Chrysler or GM in one of the factories, and while you would work hard, you would live well. I mean, when I say well, you're not driving the Cadillac, but you're driving a nice car, you've got enough money for maybe an RV, you could live well. Well, that unwritten social contract got thrown out the window starting in about the late 1970s. And so people who lost their jobs and have continued to lose their jobs in the manufacturing sector, replaced either by international competition or technology. And actually, the misnomer is that we think that we've lost manufacturing jobs to international competition. By far, we've lost many more jobs due to technology. They resent business because they feel that I had a deal with you. I worked hard for you, Chrysler, and you laid me off. And while the auto industry is certainly hiring again, and actually they can't fill enough jobs, they're hiring a very different kind of person than they let go. Even in the factory, and if you haven't been to an automotive factory, you should go now. It is absolutely amazing. It is clean, it is quiet, there's technicians running around in lab coats, computers are doing a lot of the work. You have to have a minimum of a 2-year associate's degree. And in an area in the city of Detroit where the educational achievement has been so low, that's a huge challenge.
That's happened here as well. I mean, when we lost the timber industry, we lost a lot of jobs that people were able to step into, and with a high school degree as that industry declined. And we've been lucky to hold on to our manufacturing industry, probably better than most American regions have. But again, we need to improve the quality of education in all of those industries and people stepping into them. One thing we're dealing with, and I think it speaks to that loss of those middle-level jobs, is income polarization. We're seeing that all over the country. We're seeing it here. But in Detroit, it's very stark. You have very well-off suburban areas and then a core that is hurting really badly. What are you guys doing to address income polarization and bringing those middle-level jobs back?
Well, those are national trends. The income polarization, the difference between the haves and the have-nots in this country is growing. In fact, Sandy, I'm sure you've seen this data as well too, that social mobility across generations in the United States is now lower than a lot of European nations. And we'd always thought that the United States, so the great thing about the United States is that you could start from nothing and become everything, and we're now finding that actually that is less possible now than it has been. So, there's no magic bullet solution to the question that you're asking. So it's a combination of education work. We spend a lot of time on education issues, primarily K through 12 in the city of Detroit, and STEM education for adults to get those middle skills. It's also, taking Detroit and, eating the elephant one piece at a time. We're not going to be able to fix the city of Detroit all in one big swath. So, obviously been working on downtown, and that is working. As I mentioned in my remarks, the downtown core is reviving. And we're going to have to start picking neighborhoods that, have some either market-based or public policy solution that is long-term viable, and then do the next one and do the next one. One last thing. A lot of communities, Portland, Pittsburgh is probably the best example. If there is a distressed area, you can work on what's called an edge strategy. You fix one neighborhood, and then the neighborhood next to it kind of starts to fix itself because of proximity. You can't do that in Detroit. Detroit was too big geographically for the 2 million people that lived there in 1950. Now that there's less than 700,000 people living in the city, you can fix one neighborhood. You can put all the resources into one neighborhood, and there's still some spectacular neighborhoods in Detroit. But you still have to get in a car and drive several miles to get to the next neighborhood, so the edge strategy doesn't work.
A few years ago, a number of us went to Detroit on a best practices trip. I think you had just started your current job. And we were struck, number one, by the optimism in the city, the investment from the philanthropic.
We drink a lot, so it helps.
I hope you're drinking Portland beer. There was a lot of real great effort from your your charitable organizations and others to see the investment and to really bring it back. So we saw the excitement. We also saw the huge challenges you face. And one thing that struck all of us was in all the meetings we had, I would say that overall 90% of the people that we spoke to were white. And this is in a city that is over 80% people of color. And so how are you making sure that all of the communities are at the table and you're getting buy-in from all of the communities within Detroit as you move forward and have a strategy? Because addressing the African American community and others and bringing them to the table must be critical to your strategy there.
Yeah, so I find that fascinating, and obviously, actually, I was here in Portland when you were in Detroit. I remember that. I think we kind of passed at the airport. The whole idea of ensuring that organizations and efforts are well represented by all the stakeholders, if you will. I don't think that's any different than Detroit than it is in Portland. In fact, I'm kind of shocked that it was that much of a balance, because you had mentioned that to me before we took the stage, and I'm kind of thinking about the people that I deal with as peers on a regular basis, and it is as diverse as you'd expect that area to be. So that kind of it's kind of, I think the challenge is how do you get folks who live in the neighborhoods involved in what's happening. And we actually now have a plan called the Detroit City Future Plan that took 3 years to build, and it was all built on neighborhood input. And it's the first plan that Detroit has created, extensively funded by philanthropy. I'm sure you talked to the Kresge Foundation when you were there, and that's who funded it. And that plan actually has sustainability because it has so much buy-in from the neighborhoods and the various constituencies.
Great. So you're bringing young people back to the city, key to making the city healthy again. But you talked about your schools, you talked about public safety issues. How do you keep those young people there when they start having kids and they care about the schools and the safety issues become bigger to them?
Wow. You're putting your journalist hat on, aren't you? That's going to be a challenge. Now, this is going to sound probably not correct, but there is an arc to who lives in densely urban areas. You can take the most successful urban areas in the country, Portland being one of them, and you see an arc. There is, when you're young and single or newly married, you want to be in the urban environment. And then there is a trend, once you start having young kids, to move out to the suburbs. A lot of that is schools, but not always. A lot of it is space. It's hard if you've got kids at home and you're living in a townhouse to do that. So the first step for Detroit is, the school system desperately needs to be fixed, and that's going to be a generation in the making, although we're doing some really interesting things right now. But we need to make Detroit a comfortable, safe place, and it is rapidly becoming, for those just starting out, young professionals and empty nesters. And I kind of remind my fellow Detroiters all the time that we don't have to set the bar here tomorrow when just about every other successful city has the bar here in terms of keeping middle-aged people with families in the city. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Sandy. This has been extremely interesting to get your perspective about Detroit. And now we are going to take questions for the audience. If you have a written question, you can put it on an index card and hold it up high, and the City Club staff will collect it. And if you have a question for Sandy, you can go to the podiums. Yes, sir.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. Michigan is one of the largest states in the union for the FIRST program, for inspiration and recognition of science and technology. And so my question is there an effort, because it's a business-supported program, to invest in the kids in the city to get them engaged in STEM in this extracurricular program?
Yes. And the way we're doing it is that we've actually set up an entirely separate school district within the city of Detroit. So we went to the state legislature with our governor and set up a new educational district called the Educational Achievement Authority. It is a statewide school district just for the lowest performing schools in the state, which happen to be in Detroit. This school district has some really radical ideas. One, principals have the authority to hire and fire. There are no grade levels. It is all based on you progress as you can, and it is, in addition to supported by public dollars, it is also supported by philanthropy dollars that ourselves and others are starting to raise, and STEM is a huge part of that. In fact, STEM education across the state of Michigan is a huge, huge issue because, our automotive industry, which is really the mobility industry, our IT industry, which is huge and growing, we've got an amazing healthcare, medical devices, medical research cluster in the state and in Detroit that are desperate for workers. The state of Michigan has just shy of 70,000 open jobs available right now. Most of them are in the STEM field, so STEM is a huge focus for us.
It is in Oregon as well. The governor and the legislature formed the STEM Council, which has a lot of private industry involvement in it. It's very important to our future. Yes.
Hi, Sandy. Peter Fenner, City Club member. Thank you for what I think is the best talk I've ever heard at City Hall, at City Club rather. Pardon me for anybody who's done other talks. What?
And we have to bring him in from Detroit, boy.
Well, he's really an Oregonian. So
Listen, I've heard Jesse Jackson at this podium, so I know I'm way down on the list.
Okay. What, if you were mayor of Portland, what is the first major undertaking that you would engage in?
First thing I'd do is I'd call Sam and say, hey, what the hell am I doing here? So here's, listen, I haven't lived in Portland since 2001. So I'm not in a position to, talk about what's going right or what's going wrong in Portland. But, as someone who's in and out of town, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, the question I have is, what is the city doing to sustain the ability to create wealth in the city? I know it is this fantastic place to spend money, and and people can want to live here, but in order to keep people living in an area, and in order to keep the tax revenue to support the kind of high standard of public living that we have in Portland and other great cities, what's the long-term strategy to pay the bills? Where's the wealth creation going to come from? And because living well in Portland means that wealth is being created someplace. It kind of appears to me, just as I come to my hometown almost as a tourist these days, right? It almost seems like the wealth creation is occurring someplace else that you have to drive to, and then you come back and you kind of spend the money here. That's kind of a tenuous long-term economic strategy. Because what happens if the other place where the wealth is being created becomes a cool place, or that the premium that is being charged for living in this wonderful place of Portland becomes too high to support that? So those are the questions I'd ask.
Or if I may add, that our tax rates become too high to keep people with wealth in our region, which is a huge problem that we face here. We're actually losing wealth. Another question, sir?
Yes, please. Sandy, a wonderful presentation. Bruce Howell, I'm a City Club member. I grew up in Detroit in the 50s and 60s, and I remember what it was. It was a wonderful place. I grew up in Highland Park, which doesn't exist anymore. After 1967, the Detroit riots, we saw fleeing from the city. And one of my observations was that Detroit was very easy to get out of. You could get to you could drive 26 miles to Pontiac and go through 10 different cities. And now all those people who have moved out, are you seeing any trend of empty nesters trying to move back in to supplant the young people who are moving in?
Yes, so the fastest growing demographic is under 35, college educated and employed, and they are living downtown. You cannot find downtown housing. These high-end lofts, condominiums, apartments, beautiful buildings that have been rehabbed, completely full. And Detroit is now actually taking advantage of its waterfront, something that Portland learned back in the 1970s and changed downtown, right? Detroit just got that memo about a decade ago. So you're starting to see developments down on the water that are attracting kind of high net worth empty nesters. So yes, you're starting to see that. The other dynamic that's happening now is that all those companies that fled that you referred to are starting to come back into the city. And so for years it was Detroit's loss, the suburbs gain. Right now, we're in a transition period where Detroit's gain are the suburbs' loss. That's not something that we as an organization play in, so what I'm trying to do, our goal is to attract outside capital investment.
We have a question from the audience, Sandy. It's, could you please speak to what the Detroit Chamber and others you're working with are doing to address the very high foreclosure rate that you had in your city, and how does that mirror what you see in Portland?
I can't speak to the Portland foreclosure problem, and actually I really can't speak an awful lot about the Detroit foreclosure problem. That's not something we're really engaged in at all. So it's a great question, but I'm sorry I really can't comment on it.
Gail Meyer, City Club member. I lived inside the city limits of Detroit for 6 years after I graduated from law school, so I'm thrilled to hear about all this resurgence going on in the downtown area. My question is about the outlying areas, the further residential areas. I keep hearing about all the blight. The deer have come back to the abandoned, blighted areas, and the fire departments are using it as testing grounds or practice grounds. What's the big vision for the big, huge, abandoned, blighted areas, and what do the city planners hope to do with that?
Well, step one, and it's occurring right now, and it's really exciting, is to actually remove the blight. One of the biggest public safety problems that the Detroit neighborhoods have is that there are so many abandoned buildings that they're an attractive nuisance, if you will, for criminal activity. And even kids walking to school are in danger because of these blighted and abandoned homes. So, and this is where the federal government has been very helpful. But we actually got, many of you are familiar with Pulte Homes. Builder of primarily kind of medium and high-end homes, was based in Michigan up until last year, and they just moved to Georgia. But the founders of the company, their family, the Pulte family, has taken on the challenge of removing blight, and what they have done is they've reversed engineered their housing building process. So they have found a way, and they're executing it now, to demolish buildings and remove all of the debris so it becomes a nice level field, not just tearing down the structure, but it becomes clean for like 1/10 of the price that was being done when frankly the local government was doing it. And so we, and I say we, the royal we here, they're going neighborhood by neighborhood and just clearing up blight, and they're working with the neighbors to do that. Then the Detroit City Future Plan, which we kind of briefly referred to, is kind of kicking in, and there's kind of a vision for each neighborhood, well, most neighborhoods. The gentleman who's about to be elected mayor has a plan to incent people to move into areas where we can create some centers of density. And again, Portland is one of the leading examples of how the importance of density is for economic growth. Because the private sector, retail, or any kind of business is not going to locate it in a place that doesn't have enough economic density to make that business viable. And the Detroit City Future Plan, plus the new mayor's efforts, plus the blight plan is working on those things, but it's a long-term process. I mean, this is not going to be turned around in 5 years.
Does the planning involve locating both business, job-creating businesses, retail, and housing in these areas?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very comprehensive approach.
Good.
Now, there's a lot of blank spots in the Detroit Future City Plan by design, because we know this is going to be a 25-year project. Great.
Yes, ma'am.
Chris Andre, City Club member. This has been fascinating. I've been following the reemergence of Detroit for a while, and what is referred to as blighted areas very often are actually community gardens, buildings given over to artists and theater. It's a place where young people are going to be creative. More so, it's sort of like Portland a few years ago, well, not to that extreme degree of things broken down, but my question for you is, we see in Portland a lot of people are coming in, and and there are concerns about, do we have the infrastructure to support limitless growth? How does one balance this rosy vision of infinite growth with the quality of life which brought that growth on a city? Are we seeing this as unquestioned good? It's almost like we have a bell curve, and Portland is just over the crest, and growth, we're at the point where growth might be a problem.
Well, we think that the key element of a good quality of life is a good job that can support families. And when we look at what Portland really needs to focus on to keep us healthy over the long term and to maintain the great quality of life we all enjoy here, so we've got to start focusing on how we develop more family wage jobs in this community. And we honestly think we can do a better job of that than we have. And that starts with a healthy business community that generates great jobs. So I think in terms of growth, you know, we have a system of land use planning that really protects our region, that works really well. What we don't have is enough land to build jobs, more employment-ready land, and we need to work on that.
Unfortunately, we've run out of broadcast time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week for the presentation of the Civic Awards with a keynote by Chief Education Officer Nancy Golden. And as we close today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to our speakers, Sandy Baruah and Sandra McDonough.